For 22 years, Thomas lived in the shadow of his sister Carol's disappearance. In 1974, she and her entire dance troupe vanished, leaving behind only whispers of a cult or a secret escape to Europe. Now in '96, the cold case is ripped open by a single phone call. A demolition crew preparing to tear down a derelict warehouse in Detroit has found the sole of a dance shoe, a relic from a past Thomas has been trying to forget. What do you think is the real story behind a clue that takes more than 2 decades to surface? Share your thoughts in the comments below as we piece this mystery together. The hum of the fluorescent lights in Thomas's cubicle was the soundtrack to his life. At 47, he was an accountant, a man who dealt in numbers because they were predictable and finite. They balanced. They made sense. His life, on the other hand, had been thrown off balance in the spring of 1974 and had never truly righted itself. He was staring at a spreadsheet, the columns blurring together, when the call came. It wasn't his work line, but the personal one he kept for family emergencies, though the only family he had left was his aging mother in a nursing home. He picked it up. A gruff voice on the other end identified himself as a Detective Davis with the Detroit Police Department. The city's name hit Thomas like a physical blow. He hadn't been back since the funeral that wasn't a funeral, the empty memorial service they held for Carol a year after she disappeared. The detective spoke in a practiced, dispassionate tone, explaining that a work crew at a condemned industrial site had found something, an artifact, the sole of a woman's shoe, rubber, and worn, found in a corner of the main floor. The detective said a name was stamped on the inside of the rubber, Starlight Dancers. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. The Starlight Dancers. That was the name of Carol's troupe. 12 of them, including his sister, had vanished from the face of the earth. He remembered the initial investigation. Police had treated it like a runaway case. Young people in the 70s were known for chasing freedom, joining communes, or running off to find themselves. The idea of 12 of them doing it at once seemed strange, but not impossible. The investigation had sputtered out within a year, leaving a void that had swallowed his family's happiness. This shoe sole was the first piece of tangible evidence in 22 years. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a false sighting from a trucker who thought he saw Carol working in a diner in Arizona. It was real. It was something to hold on to. "I'll be there tomorrow," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. He hung up the phone, the office hum fading into a dull roar in his ears. He stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked out of the office without a word to his supervisor. For the first time in over 2 decades, he had a destination other than the bottom of a spreadsheet. He had a glimmer of hope, and it was terrifying. The flight to Detroit was a blur. Thomas stared out the window at the clouds, his mind replaying the last time he saw Carol. She had been vibrant, laughing, full of a fierce energy that seemed too big for their small suburban home. She was 25, the lead choreographer of her own troupe, and on the cusp of making a real name for herself. He was a quiet, bookish teenager who idolized his older sister's passion. She had ruffled his hair and promised to send him a postcard from their upcoming residency in the city. The postcard never came. Detective Davis met him at the station. He was younger than Thomas, with a tired look that suggested he'd seen too much. He slid a clear evidence bag across the table. Inside was the shoe sole. It was blackened with age and grime, a pathetic-looking piece of rubber. But Thomas saw the faint, star-shaped tread pattern they had custom-ordered. He saw the ghost of his sister's foot, the powerful, graceful instrument of her art. "It's theirs," Thomas said, his voice thick. The warehouse was in a forgotten part of the city, a landscape of decaying brick and shattered windows. It was a massive 4-story structure scheduled for demolition in a week. Thomas stood before it, the cold autumn wind whipping around him. This was where the clue had been found. This was where the trail began again. The detective explained the history of the building. In the 70s, it was owned by a man named Edward, a wealthy and reclusive arts benefactor known for his eccentric patronage. "He was a person of interest back then," Davis said, flipping through a worn file. "Funded the Starlight Dancers, gave them a residency space. But he had an airtight alibi for the week they disappeared, hosted a major symphony fundraiser at his estate. Dozens of high-profile witnesses. Edward was now in his late 70s, still living in his Grosse Pointe mansion, a virtual recluse. The police had paid him a visit after the shoe was found. He claimed to remember the troupe fondly, but had no information. He was a powerful man, even in his old age, and the department was reluctant to push him without more evidence. A single shoe sole wasn't enough to get a warrant to search his property. The trail felt cold again, almost before it had begun. Thomas felt a familiar despair creep in, but he pushed it away. He wouldn't let it end here. He had one advantage the police didn't. This was personal. He spent the next 2 days at the public library, poring over microfiche of old newspapers and city records. He searched for anything related to the warehouse, to Edward, to the Starlight Dancers. He found reviews of their performances, articles praising Carroll's innovative choreography. And then he found a small piece in a business journal from 1973 about Edward's portfolio of properties, which included the warehouse. It mentioned a property manager. It was a long shot, but it was a name. Finding former employees of a company that had managed a single property over 2 decades ago was a needle in a haystack task. Thomas knew the police wouldn't dedicate resources to it, so he took out an ad in the Detroit Free Press, seeking former employees of the North River Industrial Warehouse, circa 1972-1975, information needed regarding a historical inquiry, substantial reward offered. He drained a significant portion of his savings to pay for the ad and the reward, but it felt like a necessary investment. For a week, there was nothing. Thomas's hope began to fray. He was staying in a cheap motel, eating takeout, and calling his mother every night to tell her he was fine, that there was no news yet. Then, one evening, the motel phone rang. The voice on the other end was old and shaky. "I saw your ad. I used to work at that warehouse." The man's name was George. He was a retired janitor who had worked at the warehouse from its purchase by Edward until it was shuttered in late 1974. Thomas agreed to meet him at a small diner the next morning. George was a small, stooped man with watery eyes that darted around as if he expected trouble at any moment. He was scared. Thomas bought him coffee and gently explained who he was and what he was looking for. He showed him a picture of Carol. George stared at the photo, his hand trembling slightly as he held his coffee cup. "I remember her," he whispered. "She was full of fire, that one. All of them were. So much life." He then spoke of Edward. He described the benefactor's frequent visits to the warehouse, his eyes always on Carol. It wasn't the supportive gaze of a patron, it was possessive, obsessive. George said Edward had a special rehearsal space built for the troupe in the basement of the warehouse. It was his gift to them, his gift to Carol. Thomas leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What happened to that rehearsal space?" George looked over his shoulder, then lowered his voice even more. "That's the thing that never sat right with me. The night of that big fire..." It wasn't a big fire, just a small electrical fire on the 3rd floor. "We put it out with an extinguisher in 10 minutes. But Mr. Edward, he showed up in a panic. Said he smelled gas, that a main line in the basement must have ruptured. He ordered us to evacuate and called in his own private construction crew." "What did they do?" Thomas asked, barely breathing. George took a deep, shaky breath. "They sealed the basement, the whole section where the studio was. Cinder blocked it right up to the ceiling. Mr. Edwards said it was too dangerous, that the whole foundation could go up. The next day he put everyone on paid leave and shut the warehouse down for good a month later. He told us the Starlight Dancers had left for a last-minute European tour he'd arranged. We never saw them again." A soundproofed basement, a fake gas leak, a wall of cinder blocks. The official story was a lie, the whispers of a cult, the theory of a runaway troupe. It was all a cover for something far more sinister that had happened right here in the city, buried for 22 years behind a wall of concrete and fear. Thomas left the diner with a chilling certainty. He knew where his sister was. He drove straight to the police station and laid out everything George had told him to Detective Davis. The detective listened, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to focused intensity. The story of a sealed-off basement, told by a credible eyewitness, changed everything. It was more than enough to get a judge to sign a warrant. The next morning, the demolition of the North River Industrial Warehouse was put on hold. Instead of a wrecking ball, a construction crew arrived with jackhammers and sledgehammers. Thomas stood outside the yellow police tape, watching as they broke through the cinder block wall George had described. Dust billowed out from the opening, thick and stale. The officers put on masks before going in. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, a grim-faced Detective Davis emerged. He walked over to Thomas and put a hand on his shoulder. "You should prepare yourself," he said softly. "We found them." They brought them out one by one, the remains of 12 young lives cut short. Thomas didn't look. He couldn't. He just stood there, the cold Detroit wind feeling like ice in his veins, as the ghosts of 1974 were finally brought into the light. The confrontation with Edward took place at his palatial estate. The man who had haunted Thomas's life for decades was a shrunken figure, lost in a wingback chair, an oxygen tube in his nose. He was surrounded by priceless art, but his eyes were as lifeless as the portraits on the walls. At first, he denied everything, his voice a papery rasp. He dismissed George as a disgruntled, senile employee. He claimed the sealed basement was a necessary safety precaution. He was calm, arrogant, protected by a lifetime of wealth and power. Then, Detective Davis placed a small evidence bag on the polished mahogany table in front of him. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, tarnished with age, with a single star-shaped charm. It was the necklace their father had given Carol for her 21st birthday. It had been found with her remains. Edward stared at the necklace, and for the first time, a crack appeared in his composure. His frail body began to shake. The confession came out in a broken, rambling torrent of words. He had been obsessed with Carol. He saw her talent, her fire, and believed it belonged to him. He built the studio for her, a gilded cage he thought would win her affection. He asked her to marry him that night, in the basement studio, in front of her entire troupe. He offered her the world. She had laughed. A gentle, pitying laugh, he said, but it had shattered his pride. She told him her art was not for sale, and neither was she. In a fit of rage, he slid the heavy studio door shut and locked it, telling them he wouldn't let them out until Carol changed her mind. He was going to teach her a lesson about gratitude. He went upstairs to his office in the warehouse to wait. That's when the small electrical fire broke out on the third floor. It was nothing, a minor incident, but in his panicked, enraged state, it felt like an opportunity. It was the perfect excuse. He could seal the basement, claim there was a gas leak, and no one would ever question it. He said he never meant for them to die. He said he was going to let them out after a day or two. But fear and pride took over. Admitting what he'd done was impossible. So he walked away and let them fade into a ghost story. A few months later, a memorial was held. Not an empty one this time. 12 caskets lay before an altar, surrounded by grieving families who finally had answers, if not peace. Thomas stood before Carol's grave, the polished granite cool beneath his fingertips. The gaping wound that had defined his life had not magically healed, but it had finally been closed. He no longer had to search for his sister in the faces of strangers or listen for her in the whispers of conspiracy theories. He could remember her now, not for how she vanished, but for how brightly she had lived. The benefactor, Edward, was too frail to stand trial and died under house arrest before he could be sentenced. Do you think justice was truly served in the end? Or does a confession without consequence leave a void? Let me know your perspective. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing and joining our community for more true stories that deserve to be told.